Remember, ladies and gentlemen, that while you may be sitting in your chair with disbelief written all over your face, don't believe anything you've heard on this broadcast or on any other broadcast. Don't believe anything that you read from any publication or any book or anything that you see on any television program or from any movie unless you personally check it out and verify its authenticity for yourself. If you fail to do that, then you will always be a puppet on the end of someone else's string, and when they pull that string, you will dance, because that's exactly what you're supposed to do.
Welcome to my series on Bill Cooper's Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. This is part 5, a continuation of the economic model. This future-proof past? Let's begin and find out. This doctrine is the first chapter in his book, Behold a Pale Horse, and it was published in 1991. Time flow relationships and self-destructive oscillations. An ideal industry may be symbolized electronically in various ways. The simplest way is to represent a demand by a voltage and a supply by a current. When this is done, the relationship between the two becomes what is called an admittance, which can result from 3 economic factors. 1, hindsight flow, 2, present flow, and 3, foresight flow. Foresight flow is the result of that property of living entities to cause energy or food to be stored for a period of low energy, like the winter season. It consists of demands made upon an economic system for that period of low energy or winter season. In a production industry, it takes several forms, one of which is known as production stock or inventory. In electronic symbology, this specific industry demand, a pure capital industry, is represented by capacitance, and the stock or resource is represented by a stored charge. Satisfaction of an industry demand suffers a lag because of the loading effect of inventory priorities. Present flow ideally involves no delays. It is, so to speak, input today for output today, a hand-to-mouth flow. In electronic symbology, this specific industry demand is represented by a conductance, which is then a simple economic value. Hindsight flow is known as habit or inertia. In electronics, this phenomenon is the characteristic of an inductor, in which a current flow creates a magnetic field, which, if the current begins to diminish, collapse to maintain the current. Other large alternatives to war as economic inductors or economic flywheels are an open-ended social welfare program or an enormous open-ended space program. The problem with stabilizing the economic system is that there is too much demand on account of 1, too much greed, and 2, too much population. This creates excessive economic inductance, which can only be balanced with economic capacitance. The social welfare program is nothing more than an open-ended credit balance system which creates a false capital industry to give non-productive people a roof over their heads and food in their stomachs. This can be useful, however, because the recipients become state property in return for the quote-unquote gift, a standing army for the elite. For he who pays the piper picks the tune. Those who get hooked on the economic drug must go to the elite for a fix. In this, the method of introducing large amounts of stabilizing capacitance is by borrowing on the future quote-unquote credit of the world. This is a fourth law of motion, onset and consists of performing an action and leaving the system before the reflected reaction returns to the point of action, or a delayed reaction. The means of surviving the reaction is by changing the system before the reaction can return. By this means, politicians become popular in their own time, and the public pays for it later. In fact, the measure of such a politician is the delay time. The same thing is achieved by a government by printing money beyond the limit of the gross national product, an economic process called inflation. Note: remember that inflation is only the act of printing money in excess of gross national product. They could blame it on the price of widgets or oil only because you never knew the real cause. The real cause and the only cause of inflation is the printing of more money beyond the gross national product. This puts a large quantity of money into the hands of the public and maintains a balance against their greed, creates a false self-confidence in them, and for a while stays the wolf from the door. They must eventually resort to war to balance the account, because war ultimately is merely the act of destroying the creditor, and the politicians are the publicly hired hitmen that justify the act to keep the responsibility and blood off the public conscience. See section on consent factors and social economic structuring. If the people really cared about their fellow man, they would control their appetites, like greed, so that they would not have to operate on a credit or welfare social system which steals from the worker to satisfy the bum. Since most of the general public will not exercise restraint, there are only two alternatives to reduce the economic inductance of the system. Number one, let the populace bludgeon each other to death in war, which will only result in a total destruction of the living earth. Number two, take control of the world by the use of economic quote-unquote silent weapons in a form of quote-unquote quiet warfare, and reduce the economic inductance of the world to a safe level by a process of benevolent slavery and genocide. The latter option has been taken as the obviously better option. At this point, it should be crystal clear to the reader why absolute secrecy about the silent weapons is necessary. The general public refuses to improve its own mentality and its faith in its fellow man. It has become a herd of proliferation barbarians, so to speak, a blight upon the face of the earth. They do not care enough about economic science to learn why they have not been able to avoid war despite religious morality, and their religious or self-gratifying refusal to deal with earthly problems renders the solution of the earthly problem unreachable by them. It is left to those few who are truly willing to think and survive as the fittest to survive, to solve the problem for themselves as the few who really care. Otherwise, exposure of the silent weapon would destroy our only hope of preserving the seed of future true humanity.